The applause was still echoing when my husband stood up. Caps were midair. Parents were wiping tears. Our daughter had just walked the stage, chin lifted, future wide open. And that's when he leaned toward the microphone meant for thanking donors and said, evenly, almost politely, "I've decided to start a new life without my wife." The air snapped. I felt every head turn. I noticed the girl first, young, composed, sitting among our friends like she belonged there. She didn't look at me. She didn't have to. My husband did. He waited for something from me. Shock, tears, collapse. I smiled instead. Not the brittle kind. The calm one that arrives when you finally understand the rules of a game you didn't know you were playing. "Congratulations on your honesty," I said softly. Then I handed him an envelope. He laughed until he opened it. "Before you decide what kind of woman I am, let me ask you one question. What would you do if the person who knew your quiet sacrifices chose the loudest moment of your child's life to erase you?" My name is Alexis. I'm not dramatic. I don't raise my voice to be heard. I've learned that timing speaks louder than pain ever could. If you stay with me, I won't rush you. This isn't a story about rage. It's about composure and what happens when silence finally gets documentation. For most of my marriage, I existed as the structure no one noticed unless it cracked. I handled the calendars, the deadlines, the school meetings scheduled during work hours. I remembered which teachers preferred emails and which ones took phone calls personally. I packed lunches even when I had early meetings of my own. I learned to smile when my husband, Evan, introduced himself as the one holding everything together, while I stood beside him holding the folders. I had a career once that asked more of me than flexibility. I let it go when our daughter, Lily, was born, not because Evan demanded it, but because the system around us rewarded the parent who bent first. And bending became my specialty. Evan's world expanded as mine compressed. Promotions. Panels. Dinners where spouses were expected to listen, not speak. I became fluent in quiet support. In anticipation. In being useful without being visible. At home, he relied on me completely. At work events, he forgot to mention me at all. I told myself this was balance. That marriages tilt and correct themselves over time. That respect, like interest, compounds quietly. What I didn't see, what no one warns you about, is how easily silence can be mistaken for permission. How endurance, when unacknowledged, begins to look like insignificance to the wrong kind of person. By the time Lily reached graduation, I had already been shrinking for years. The first signs weren't explosive. They were administrative. Evan stopped asking before making decisions that affected both of us. He changed travel plans without checking. He spoke about me in conversations where I was present, using phrases like "Alexis is fine with whatever" or "she doesn't really care about that stuff." I corrected him once. He laughed and said, "See? Easy going." At Lily's school events, he began arriving late and leaving early, always with an apology that felt rehearsed. I stayed. I filled the silence. Other parents praised my consistency as if it were a personality trait, not unpaid labor. Then there was the phone. It stopped living on the kitchen counter and started sleeping face down beside him. Notifications muted. Calls taken in the garage. When I asked, gently, he said I was imagining patterns because I had too much time to think. I noticed the way his friends' wives began avoiding my eyes. How invitations arrived addressed only to him. How one woman I'd known for years hugged me a second too long and whispered, "You're very strong," without explanation. I didn't confront him. Not because I was afraid, but because I was tired of being told that clarity was insecurity. So I watched. I remembered dates. I noticed absences disguised as busyness. And slowly, something shifted inside me. I stopped trying to restore balance. I started documenting imbalance. Once Evan realized I wasn't pushing back, he mistook my quiet for surrender. He grew casual with his dismissals. He canceled our anniversary dinner with a text sent 15 minutes before the reservation. He joked in front of friends that I preferred staying home anyway, even though I'd already changed into the dress he once said made me look confident. When I didn't correct him, his confidence sharpened. At home, he narrated his life as if I were a roommate, not a partner. New projects. New connections. New perspectives on outgrowing old versions of ourselves. He spoke in the language of self-improvement, careful to frame abandonment as evolution. Publicly, he was generous. Privately, he was absent. The woman appeared gradually, never named, always implied. A colleague who understood pressure. Someone who didn't take things personally. I met her once at a charity dinner. She shook my hand with professional warmth and thanked me for supporting Evan's demanding schedule, as if I were an assistant, not a wife. When I finally asked him if there was someone else, he smiled with pity. Said I was projecting my fears onto his growth. Said real trust meant not needing constant reassurance. So I trusted my instincts instead. I stopped filling in for him. I let him forget things. I allowed small consequences to surface where I used to smooth them away. He didn't notice, because people rarely notice the labor that prevents embarrassment until it's gone. By the time he chose our daughter's graduation as the stage for his announcement, he believed two things completely. That I was too passive to resist. And that everyone would understand his choice. Silence has a way of echoing back at you when no one else is speaking. Friends I'd known for years stopped calling. Invitations thinned, then vanished. When I reached out, conversations stayed polite but shallow, as if I'd become a topic everyone was avoiding. I later learned Evan had been preparing them, sharing concerns about my emotional state, my difficulty adapting, my tendency to take things too seriously. It was a clean narrative. Concerned husband. Fragile wife. I began questioning myself. Not the facts, I had dates, messages, absences written down, but my reactions to them. Was I being unreasonable by expecting presence? Was it unfair to want transparency from someone who clearly wanted distance? There were nights I sat at the kitchen table long after Lily had gone to bed, rereading old emails from Evan, looking for when the tone changed, when partnership turned into politeness. I wondered if my calm had taught him I didn't need care. But even in doubt, I kept my posture. I didn't beg. I didn't accuse. I didn't perform grief for an audience. I showed up to events alone and left with dignity intact. People filled the silence with their own assumptions, and I let them. The exhaustion was quiet but constant. The kind that doesn't announce itself with tears but with numbness. Still, I held one line firm. I would not collapse publicly to make anyone comfortable with what was happening privately. Evan misread this restraint as weakness. He couldn't see that while he was rehearsing his exit story, I was slowly detaching from the version of myself that needed his approval to feel legitimate. The first real blow came quietly, disguised as inevitability. Evan filed for separation before I said a word. He framed it as a mutual decision, telling our families he was giving me space to find myself. By the time I was informed, the paperwork was already circulating, temporary arrangements, financial freezes, polite legal language that assumed my cooperation. At the same time, he moved money. Not everything. Just enough to limit my flexibility. Accounts I'd managed for years suddenly required his approval. Credit cards declined at grocery stores where the cashiers knew my name. When I called the bank, I was told changes had been made per the primary holder. People noticed. Whispers started. A few relatives suggested I should be grateful he was being civil. One friend advised me not to make things worse by fighting back. For a moment, even I wondered if this was the end of my relevance. If I had already been edited out of my own life without realizing it. Lily tried not to ask questions. She watched me carefully, as if measuring how much ground was safe to stand on. That restraint hurt more than any accusation could have. Evan, meanwhile, became generous with advice. He suggested mediation. He offered to help me transition. He spoke with the confidence of someone certain the story was already decided. And for the outside world, it looked like I was losing. I let it. Because sometimes the most effective way to reveal a person's strategy is to give them enough room to believe it's working. I didn't unravel the way people expected. I adjusted. I canceled subscriptions. I cooked differently. I learned which expenses could wait and which couldn't. When the bank limited my access, I documented dates, authorization logs, and names. I didn't argue with clerks. I thanked them and asked for confirmation in writing. At home, I became deliberate. I kept Lily's routine unchanged, same breakfast, same ride to school, same nightly check-in at her door. I refused to let instability reach her, even when it sat heavy in my chest. Evan mistook this steadiness for dependence. He spoke slowly to me now, carefully, as if explaining complex ideas to someone who might misunderstand. When he made offers, temporary allowances, supervised access to funds, I listened without reacting. And I took notes. I stopped trying to be believed by people who had already chosen a simpler story. Instead, I focused on being accurate. Calm accuracy has a way of aging well. At night, when the house was quiet, I organized emails into folders. Financial statements by quarter. Messages cross-referenced with dates I already had. I didn't yet know what I would need, but I knew I would need something. Endurance, I learned, isn't passive. It's the discipline of not wasting energy before the moment that requires it. By the time the graduation ceremony arrived, I wasn't hoping for justice. I was prepared for truth. Clarity didn't arrive as a revelation. It emerged through repetition. I noticed how Evan's explanations followed the same rhythm: concern, dismissal, redirection. How every time I asked for transparency, he reframed it as emotional instability. How his generosity appeared only when witnesses were present and his control tightened in private. The pattern extended beyond us. He told people different versions of the same story, calibrated to their sympathies. To his parents, I was overwhelmed. To colleagues, I was resistant to change. To friends, I was strong but inflexible. None of the stories contradicted each other outright, they simply omitted me. What finally shifted something inside me wasn't anger. It was the realization that he didn't see me as an opponent at all. He saw me as an obstacle already cleared. That's when I stopped reacting to content and started tracking behavior. Timelines replaced feelings. Statements were measured against actions. His confidence grew with each unchecked assumption, and with it, his carelessness. I understood then that the advantage wasn't dramatic confrontation, it was patience. People who believe they've won rarely protect their trail. The day before graduation, Evan sent me a message outlining how we would present ourselves for Lily. Cordial. United. Brief. He ended it with, "We owe her that much." I agreed. Not because I owed him anything, but because the stage he'd chosen was finally large enough to hold the truth he'd been compressing for months. What Evan never realized, what no one realized, was that I had already stepped outside the emotional frame he was controlling. Months earlier, when the bank first mentioned primary holder authorization, I requested a full activity log. Not a summary. A log. Dates, IP addresses, timestamps. I asked again when they hesitated, citing compliance language they didn't expect me to know. The email arrived 2 days later. I compared it to our shared calendar. Transfers made while Evan claimed to be in meetings. Account changes approved during nights he said he was asleep beside me. Small inconsistencies, individually harmless, collectively precise. Then there were the messages. Not his to me, those were clean, but his to others. A former assistant forwarded an email she thought was odd. A friend sent a screenshot with an apology and a question mark. I never replied emotionally. I thanked them and asked for the original files. I kept everything untouched. Metadata intact. Originals preserved. I consulted quietly. Not a dramatic lawyer's office, not a confrontation. A documentation specialist first. Someone who explained, calmly, what patterns meant in formal language. What constituted misrepresentation. What actions looked intentional once arranged chronologically. By the time I spoke to an attorney, I wasn't asking what I could do. I was asking when. The envelope I prepared wasn't symbolic. It was procedural. A notice of financial irregularities. A request for preservation of records. A copy of correspondence that contradicted his sworn statements. It wasn't a threat. It was a mirror. Evan believed the graduation would be my breaking point. He believed public pressure would keep me contained. What he didn't understand was that credibility doesn't need volume, only consistency. And consistency was already on my side. Somewhere between collecting evidence and understanding it, I changed. I stopped checking my phone for messages that never came. I stopped rehearsing conversations in my head, imagining explanations Evan would never hear. The constant background noise of self-justification faded, replaced by something steadier. I no longer needed him to acknowledge the damage for it to be real. There was relief in that. A lightness I hadn't felt in years. I slept better, not longer, but deeper. I moved through days without bracing for disappointment. Even my posture shifted, shoulders settling into a neutral place instead of a defensive one. When Evan spoke now, I listened differently. Not for validation, not for affection, but for information. His words became data points, his tone a measure of confidence. I noticed how often he filled silence with assumptions, how rarely he asked questions anymore. Power, I realized, doesn't announce itself. It becomes visible when you stop performing for the person who once defined the stage. I didn't rush. I didn't fantasize about outcomes. I focused on precision. On protecting Lily's emotional space. On ensuring that whatever happened next would not require me to raise my voice to be believed. By the morning of the graduation, I wasn't nervous. I was clear. I wore a neutral dress. I arrived early. I sat where I could see the aisle and the exits. When Evan took his seat with his hand resting casually on the arm of the woman beside him, I registered it without reaction. Detachment isn't coldness. It's clarity without interference. And clarity, once settled, doesn't waver under lights. The final steps weren't dramatic. They were deliberate. I rehearsed nothing. I prepared instead. I confirmed seating arrangements and verified the program schedule. I knew exactly when the microphone would be open and when it wouldn't. I coordinated with the school administrator, not about Evan, but about post-ceremony logistics. I made sure Lily's name would be called cleanly, without interruption. This day was hers first. The envelope stayed sealed until that morning. Inside were 3 copies of the same document, each addressed differently. One for Evan. One for his attorney. One for the financial institution he believed had already sided with him. Each was time-stamped. Each referenced attachments already submitted electronically hours earlier. I dressed plainly on purpose. Nothing that would read as provocation. Nothing that would invite interpretation. Neutral colors don't attract speculation, they absorb it. I told no one what I was planning. Not friends. Not family. Silence protects strategy better than loyalty ever could. The fewer people involved, the fewer variables that could fail. I timed my presence carefully. I sat through the ceremony. I applauded at the right moments. I watched Lily cross the stage with her name spoken clearly, her future unburdened by adult conflict. Only then, only after, did I stand. Evan had already positioned himself near the aisle, ready to speak to acquaintances, to control the narrative as he always did. When he reached for the microphone, I didn't stop him. I let him announce his version of freedom. Because timing isn't about speed. It's about accuracy. The auditorium was still warm with applause when Evan took the microphone. He thanked the faculty. Congratulated the graduates. Smiled like a man unburdened. Then, without looking at me, he said it, measured, confident, rehearsed. That he and I would be going our separate ways. That it was time for honesty. That sometimes people outgrow the roles they once needed. A few gasps. A few stunned silences. I waited until he finished. Not because I needed permission, but because interruption would have cheapened what came next. When the microphone returned to its stand, I walked forward and picked it up. The room shifted. People leaned in, expecting collapse. Instead, I spoke evenly. I agree, I said. Honesty matters. I turned to him then, not with accusation, not with appeal. I handed him the envelope with both hands, the way you offer something formal. This is yours, I said. Open it. He smiled. He thought it was symbolic. He opened it anyway. The color left his face in stages. Evan's smile faltered almost immediately. His hands shook slightly as he unfolded the papers. The room had gone quiet, faculty, friends, and even strangers frozen mid-applause, unsure what was happening. He expected a note. A symbolic gesture. Something performative. Instead, he found documents detailing account transfers he hadn't disclosed, correspondence proving misrepresentation, and evidence of inconsistencies in his claims to the bank and our families. Every omission, every subtle lie, every assumption of my passivity was laid bare. He looked up, searching my face, realizing for the first time that I had not been passive. I had been preparing. His control, so carefully built, started crumbling under the weight of his own actions. This isn't, he stammered. His voice cracked. The confidence he wore like armor was gone. He tried to regain composure, gesturing to his girlfriend to assist, to explain, to contextualize, but there was no context that could survive the truth in front of everyone. People began whispering, connecting dots they hadn't known were connected. His parents' eyes widened. Friends shifted uncomfortably. And I stood calm. Silence amplified the impact. He tried to speak again, but the microphone now carried a weight he hadn't anticipated. Every word he uttered only drew attention to what was irrefutable. Misrepresentation. Deception. Careless arrogance. And my documentation was undeniable, legally sound, and irrevocable. In that moment, Evan realized he had overreached. What he thought would be my breaking point had become his unraveling. The more he tried to assert control, the more obvious his miscalculations became. The auditorium held its collective breath as the tension stretched. And I, Alexis, remained poised, knowing that the victory wasn't in shouting or exposing shame, but in letting facts speak for themselves. The envelope had done its work before I even opened my mouth again. I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need dramatic gestures. I simply explained the contents calmly, step by step, letting the documents speak louder than my tone. Evan's transfers and communications, I said, holding up the papers, reflect timelines and accounts that contradict what has been presented publicly. Every claim about absence, generosity, or honesty can now be verified independently. I didn't pause for effect. I didn't look for sympathy. The audience absorbed it naturally, the faculty, friends, families, even strangers who had only come to celebrate graduation. They read his expressions better than I could narrate them. Shock, denial, panic. The cracks were visible. I have copies, I continued softly, with the appropriate authorities, preserving dates and original communications. Nothing here is an interpretation, everything is documented fact. All parties involved have access. Evan's girlfriend shifted uncomfortably beside him, realizing the situation wasn't just about emotion, it was about credibility. He swallowed, searching desperately for words to reframe, to mitigate. None came that could undo what was laid bare. Some parents murmured. Others leaned forward, realizing that the drama they had anticipated, a public humiliation of me, was inverted. The truth was undeniable, and it had been quietly prepared. The timing, the restraint, the evidence, everything turned the tables silently. I paused, looking at Lily. Her eyes were wide but calm. She understood what had happened without needing explanation. Her father's chaos was not her inheritance, my composure had contained it. I returned the microphone gently. Graduation is for our children, I said. This is for her. Not for anyone else. The room absorbed that final statement. The applause that followed was uneven at first, hesitant, but then surged, not for Evan, not for me, but for the clarity of justice and integrity revealed in the quietest possible way. Evan remained frozen, his voice gone, his authority eroded, the public record now speaking louder than any defense he could muster. The fall was complete before anyone realized it was happening. Evan tried to smile, tried to salvage dignity, but it was too late. The faculty and parents who had once nodded politely at his responsibility now whispered among themselves. His friends looked sideways, uncertain. Even those who had once admired his confidence sensed the shift, his authority had evaporated in the light of indisputable truth. He stumbled through excuses, but each one only highlighted the evidence in front of everyone. His girlfriend's expressions flickered from confusion to embarrassment to panic. She had assumed a spectator role, but the audience now saw her as a participant in his miscalculations. Evan's parents were the hardest to watch. Their eyes darted between the papers and him, realization dawning that they had trusted the wrong narrative. The subtle web of deception he had spun so carefully unraveled in minutes. And I remained composed. I did not gloat. I did not raise my voice. My calm presence made his unraveling more visible. Silence amplified the power of the evidence, the clarity of timing, and the inevitability of consequence. What everyone witnessed wasn't spectacle, it was the quiet enforcement of accountability. No theatrics, no personal attacks, just the undeniable alignment of truth, documentation, and timing. By the time I left the podium, Evan was pale, his confidence shattered, and the woman beside him silent. His public collapse was complete, not through insult or confrontation, but by the weight of facts and my unwavering composure. The room exhaled collectively. Graduation continued, but the lesson lingered. Authority and control are fragile when tested against preparation, credibility, and patience. The days after graduation were calm but deliberate. Evan faced inquiries he could not sidestep. Financial institutions froze certain transactions pending clarification. Legal counsel reviewed every documented discrepancy. Friends and family adjusted their perceptions quietly, no dramatic confrontations required, the evidence had spoken louder than any argument. Lily's life continued uninterrupted. She received the graduation gifts she had been promised. She attended college orientations with pride, unaffected by the adult chaos that had threatened to overshadow her milestone. Her teachers and friends saw her mother not as a victim, but as a woman of composure and foresight. Even Evan's social circle began to distance themselves. Invitations dwindled. Observers quietly corrected their assumptions. No one questioned the integrity or composure of the woman who had handled everything with patience, clarity, and undeniable accuracy. I returned to routines, grounded in quiet authority. Daily life flowed with fewer interruptions, no sudden surprises, no whispered doubts. The power dynamic had shifted subtly but permanently. The arena that once gave him confidence now reflected my preparation, patience, and foresight. And in the middle of it all, I learned a lesson that had nothing to do with him. Strength is often invisible until it is tested in the presence of scrutiny. Calm endurance, strategic foresight, and ethical precision create irreversible outcomes. In the quiet that followed, I reflected on the journey. Humiliation, confusion, and endurance had carved a path to awareness. Control, leveraged through patience and precision, had delivered public justice without spectacle. I realized that dignity is not in dramatic declarations, it is in preparation, composure, and ethical clarity. Lily thrived. Friends and family understood her mother's strength in ways they hadn't before. Even Evan had learned, though not through words, but through the undeniable truth that preparation and quiet resolve can outlast arrogance and deceit. I kept my focus on what truly mattered, my child, my integrity, and my own sense of self. The lessons of patience, observation, and strategic action would guide me in every future challenge. Power, I understood, is often invisible until the right moment. Justice does not need to be loud, it needs to be inevitable. And as I watched Lily step confidently into her future, I knew the victory was complete, not in retaliation, but in the assurance that truth, patience, and calm resolve had secured not just justice, but dignity, for both of us.